Oftentimes with these videos, what I like to do is summarize various different theoretical perspectives and then maybe introduce some anecdotes to kind of anchor sort of what that looks like. And I think with rebel recruitment, I did that fairly well. We talked about grievances, a possible explanation. We talked about how that doesn't really explain how people overcome the collective action problem. And then we shifted to talking about private benefits that people might have, talking about social networks and how those can be used to mobilize people, even when we're asking people to do things that might not be in their immediate best interest, like joining a rebel movement, or thirdly, coercion as a strategy that brings people into these movements. But it's also useful to step back and not just sort of look at the anecdotes and sort of say, well, that seems to fit with our theories, but also to look more systematically to see whether these theories actually work explaining things on a larger scale. And to do that, I'd like to review this article by Macten Humphreys and Jeremy Weinstein, in which they go to Sierra Leone and conduct a survey and ask former combatants and also people who chose not to be combatants why they made the choices that they made. And that allows for us to maybe test some of these different theories, because they asked questions about grievances and about social networks and about private benefits that people might have received, as well as looking at a wide variety of other factors that might influence a person's decision or opportunity to become a rebel or to join with a militia. To kind of introduce how this conflict works, I'd like to talk through very briefly the Sierra Leone Civil War. I'm not an expert in the Sierra Leone Civil War by any means, but I'll try and give you a rough history. So red X's mean there was a conflict where there was tension, and the green means these are sort of allies. And so initially you have the All People's Congress ruling over Sierra Leone, which gets challenged by the Revolutionary United Front. I believe it initially starts with a cohort of college students or in universities resisting the APC. The APC is then ousted in a military coup, with the National Provisional Ruling Council being sort of the entity that takes control. The Revolutionary United Front doesn't go away. It just kind of continues to persist throughout this period. And then I believe in the early 1990s, you get the Sierra Leone People's Party pushing the military junta from power. The military junta sort of shifts gears and becomes the armed forces ruling coalition and makes common cause with the Revolutionary United Front. Meanwhile, the Sierra Leone People's Party, the more civilian government, began setting up these civilian defense forces all across Sierra Leone to try to augment the security capacity of the state against these different rebel movements. And eventually you get, I believe in 1999, a peace agreement in which the various factions come together. They come up with a power sharing arrangement, but by 2000, the Revolutionary United Front is scrapping that and returns to violence, and the country relapses into civil war, at which point you get foreign intervention. I believe ECOWAS and the United Kingdom are involved, and the end result is that the Revolutionary United Front gets beaten back and the civilian government is stabilized. So that's a very rough, very quick overview of what's going on in the Sierra Leone conflict. And a first cut for analyzing sort of why people join different groups that Weinstein and Humphreys sort of explore is to just go to rebels and members of the civilian defense force and ask them straight up, why did you join? And we find is that the vast majority of, and these are not mutually exclusive, I should say, so people can give more than one answer, but the vast majority of people who joined the civilian defense forces said that they supported the group's political goals. They were supporting the government, and that's why they joined, whereas a good chunk, 88% of folks who joined the Revolutionary United Front said they joined because they were abducted, which is a huge percentage of that fighting force that was essentially conscripted or forced into a combatant role. Other things that kind of pinged for people, a lot of folks talked about that they were scared about what would happen if they chose not to join. Presumably there's some overlap with folks who are abducted, but also presumably there's not, because only 41%, 42% said that for the Revolutionary United Front. Likewise, the civilian defense forces, even though a good chunk of them said that they supported the government or they supported the group's political goals, there also seems to have been that fear component that was motivating people to join. Although I should flag here that we don't necessarily know that these are motivating people, only that these are what people are citing for their motivations. And people have a whole host of reasons to misrepresent why they did what they did, or to sort of ex post rationalize what they did. And it's sometimes useful to compare people who join these groups with people who didn't join these groups. For example, the Revolutionary United Front was an incredibly brutal group and used amputation of limbs as a weapon to terrorize the population. There were lots of folks who were probably terrified of the Revolutionary United Front, but did that actually make them more likely to join one or either of these groups because they were afraid, compared to people who were similarly afraid and chose not to join? So in order to get at that question, we need to tell a more complex story involving a statistical technique called regression analysis. And so Humphreys and Weinstein provided us a regression model, which is just a statistical way of telling a complex story that looks at multiple different things sort of simultaneously and helps us to kind of figure out how these different pieces are working together or combining to tell hopefully a coherent and useful story about why we see things in the world. And typically with regression models, we're looking for patterns, associations between variables, whereas one thing goes up, another thing goes up. So the example I oftentimes use is life expectancy and GDP per capita. As GDP per capita goes up, we see life expectancy go up as well. That's a positive relationship in that they're both going up at the same time. They're both moving in the same direction. You could have a negative relationship. GDP per capita goes up, infant mortality goes down. So it's negative not because it's bad, but because they're moving at cross purposes. It's a mathematical framing. And so regression helps us to know what those relationships look like because they give us these coefficients that tell us if the relationship is positive or negative and how one unit of change in one of our variables is affecting our outcome. In the examples I gave about life expectancy and infant mortality, those are pretty concrete numbers, right? That where we can sort of count through and know that as life expectancy is going up, you're going from living on average 76 to 77 to 78. The variables that Weinstein and Humphreys are looking at aren't quite that way. They're interested in whether you joined the Revolutionary United Front or you didn't. And joining is coded as a 1 and not joining is coded as a 0. And what we're actually doing is we're not trying to predict, we're trying to predict who ends up as a 1, and we think about that in terms of what's the probability of joining that group. And so a positive relationship means as your education level goes up, your likelihood of joining the civilian defense forces goes up as well in terms of the probability becomes greater. More people with that level of education are joining those groups. So that would be an example of a positive relationship and helping us to think about the direction of how these things are fitting together. The other thing that we look for in regression models to kind of help us understand what the story is telling us is whether things are statistically significant. And again, I'm not going to run through the whole background of what statistical significance means and how we determine it, but what I will say is that samples are right on average, assuming they're random, but every sample can be a little quirky, and some samples can be really quirky. And one of the ways that we deal with that sort of unknown quirkiness of our samples is to ask the question, I'm seeing a pattern here. Is this the kind of thing that would happen by chance with just samples being quirky? Or is this pattern so stark and so clear that it would be ridiculously unlikely that this would just be samples bouncing around, that I can believe these results and not just chalk them up to samples being quirky? And so when something sort of hits that threshold of statistical significance of this is too stark of a pattern to be ignored, we typically mark that with asterisks on our regression models so that people who are sort of looking through can see, oh, these results are the notable results that stand out and are more than just sampling variation of things bouncing around and being a little bit quirky. So as we talk through these results, we're going to look at two things. We're going to look at the direction of the coefficients to get a sense of what the relationships look like. We could talk about the magnitude, but the magnitude is a little bit hard to interpret for this type of model where we're thinking about the probability of going from not a member of the Revolutionary United Front to a member of the Revolutionary United Front. And so we'll just talk about direction and whether it hits that level of statistical significance. So I'm going to pull this up sort of in full screen, and you can kind of get a sense of lots of numbers, lots of asterisks, lots of variables. And again, each of these are telling us part of a larger story about why people joined the Revolutionary United Front in that first column of information, or in the last one, civilian defense forces. And then there's two columns in the middle that are also focused on the Revolutionary United Front. But here, Humphreys and Weinstein separate out people who were abducted versus people who were volunteers. And I think that's actually probably really important, given that we saw like 88% of people they surveyed who were part of the Revolutionary United Front said they were there because they were abducted. Well, we might want to understand how their motivations are different than people who join voluntarily. And so Weinstein and Humphreys go through and look at a couple different possible explanations. They look at grievances, they look at selective incentives, and they look at community cohesion as possible explanations. And I won't talk through all of these, but I will flag some things I think are interesting. So they measure grievances in terms of whether a person has mud walls in their house, which is, I think, a sign of poverty. And what they find is that across all the categories, or all of the columns, all of the different models that they run, being from a poor background, mud walls for your house, increases the likelihood that you will end up in a rebel group. So that actually seems to count toward the grievances argument. The results are positive and they're statistically significant across all of those models. Likewise, as literacy declines or as your access to education declines, people become more likely to join rebel groups. And so it seems like the people who are participating in these groups tend to be from the poorest backgrounds in Sierra Leone. There's a story that they tell about the Mende group, which tended to favor the government versus people who were maybe politically disaffected. They weren't connected to any particular group. And what we find is that, again, people who are maybe politically marginalized, they're not supporters of the government, but they don't have an opposition party that they support, are more likely to join, strangely, not just the Revolutionary United Front, the challenger to the government, but also the civilian defense forces as well. So maybe they're more easily mobilized, which I think is maybe a little counterintuitive. We have selective incentives. The one that I think makes the most sense, the most obvious, is just you're offered money to join. And people who joined the Revolutionary United Front, whether they were volunteers or abducted, claim that they were offered money to join, that seems to be a strong motivation for them. For the civilian defense forces, it's also a positive relationship. You're offered money to join, you're much more likely to join. In fact, the relationship is very strong and statistically significant. And so I think that selective incentives certainly is an important part of the story, above and beyond just grievances. But there's an interesting story when it comes to that idea of safety, that you feel safer when you're part of the group. Certainly people who join the civilian defense forces, that I think the coefficient is like 2.34, and the asterisk underneath it where it has the standard errors and the standard error, and then the three asterisks suggest that it's a real pattern, something that's not just random chance. That certainly stands out for those folks. But for the folks who joined or who were members of the Revolutionary United Front, people who were abducted reported, and not surprisingly, that they did not feel safer within the group. But people who volunteered did, that seems to have been a motivation for them. It increased their likelihood of joining, that was a safe place for them to go. When we look at community cohesion, they have two variables that measure this. One is whether or not you report having friends as members of the group. It doesn't have much of an effect for the civilian defense forces, but it does for people who were volunteers for the Revolutionary United Front. Having a friend in the group was a strong driver of volunteerism. Not surprisingly, people who were abducted did not have friends that were parts of the group. They were not there because of those social ties. They were there for other reasons, mainly coercion. Another measure of this is at sort of the societal level, and the way that Humphreys and Weinstein get at this is by looking at different chiefdoms in Sierra Leone and calculating, I think, the percentage of villages in those chiefdoms that are only accessible by water or by foot, but not by there's not roads, thinking that these more rural areas are going to have stronger social ties amongst the local population, and maybe that's something that can be mobilized. And we do see that to some extent when we're looking at why people join the civilian defense forces, it seems to have been most common in these tight-knit, rural, isolated communities where we see people joining into these militia groups for community protection. Okay, so we're telling the story across these different factors, and we're actually getting, I think, a lot of corroboration for some of the theories that we have about why people join rebel groups. I'm going to just flag briefly that in these models, we oftentimes also include what are called control variables, because the world is complex and there's lots of things going on above and beyond sort of what we are thinking about with our theories, and it's important to build those things into the story. And so Humphreys and Weinstein build in two different occupations. They build in whether somebody is a farmer or whether they're a student, and farmers and students seem to have been drawn into the civilian defense forces, whereas farmers were less likely to be part of the Revolutionary United Front as volunteers. So maybe that's interesting. When we look at the gender, being male greatly increased your likelihood of being part of one of these groups. And age has an interesting story as well. There's age and there's age squared, because if you think back to algebra, the equation for a parabola is, I think it's a squared plus bx plus c, or ax squared plus bx plus c. And so to get a parabola, you need a variable x, and then you need the square of it. And that's what this is essentially doing. It's creating sort of a curved pattern in our analysis so that we can find that people who are very young are less likely to be recruited. You enter military sort of service age, maybe 18-ish into early 30s, and you have a high level of likelihood of joining. And then once you pass your 40s or so, your likelihood of joining these groups starts going down again. Which I think is an interesting story. The last interesting story I'll tell is infant mortality. There's a backstory on why they included Freetown, but I'll leave that for folks who want to read the article. Infant mortality is oftentimes included in models of civil war as sort of a catch-all for whether or not things are working in society. And I think it's actually a pretty good catch-all for that, because it covers everything from sanitation infrastructure to health infrastructure to being rural to just being poor to government corruption to gender patterns and norms. There's lots of things that go into infant mortality that speak to other larger things happening in society, and places that tend to have high infant mortality have a lot of other things that are going wrong as well. And so it tends to be a fairly powerful variable in a lot of models of conflict, because it gets at a lot of those other things, which is not to say that it's necessarily intuitive to know which of those things isn't working in a particular conflict. We may have to dig in and find out what's the cause of that. But as a proxy for things don't seem to be working here, it works pretty well. Okay, so one of the things I really like about this article is it allows us to move away from talking about anecdotes, about how individual rebel groups are recruiting, or about why an individual joined a group, and to sort of think about broader patterns about where do these groups recruit from. They seem to be recruiting from poorer areas and people who are disaffected, but they're using private incentives like paying you or abducting you. I guess that's a private incentive, providing security to you. But then social ties are also part of the story. And so we end up with a very complex story that cuts across a lot of the theories that we told about how people overcome that collective action problem of, maybe I want to join this group, or maybe I don't, but my participation is largely irrelevant to whether the group succeeds or fails. And so why would I take any sort of risk to try to be the one who pushes that group across the threshold and into success, where we might see some additional benefits? I'm better off free riding, I'm better off sitting on the sidelines. And this story helps us to understand which of our explanations, and it turns out many of our explanations have some purchase in trying to understand how people get over that barrier.